Hi, photo class. This week we're week 2. You should be getting your bearings in terms of your WordPress site and working with creating galleries for images that you've created for our first short assignment. We're going to move on this week to starting our first long assignment. This is an assignment that's in 3 parts. I have the document open here. This is a Google Doc that you have access to and you can share and download and do whatever you'd like with. The header of this assignment shows a exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is going to be a very good tool for us to understand 3 settings we need to operate in order to create good exposures with our camera. I'll get to this in a second. I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to explain our first part of Long 1, which is Long 1.1, and its focus is on what's called bracketing. This is going to be due next Monday, and you're going to shoot 300 images for this assignment. I have some resources here. I have camera simulators that we'll go over in a second. I've given you 2. A reading for more in depth, if that's a way that you like to process some of this information. And then I want you to set your camera with certain settings. I'll come back to this in a minute so we are all on the same page. And then I'm going to explain more in depth as well the process by which you're going to do this assignment. Now I want to scroll back up here and I want to discuss your exposure triangle in order to make certain that we understand the same things. I'm using right now for our demo a film camera actually, because I think it's a little nicer and easier to demonstrate some of these settings. But this is a classic intro camera, film camera called a Pentax K1000. Very cheap film camera. So I'm going to start with talking about aperture. You'll notice under here that it says lens pupil under aperture, and that's a good visual for us to understand what aperture does. Now, if I take this lens off this camera, many of you know that a camera lens has an interior mechanism called an aperture. And I'm not sure if you can see this, but this aperture opens and closes. Now, that's called stopping down or opening up the lens. Now, you'll notice under here in this triangle here too, it has a series of settings. If you're looking on a lens, a traditional lens, often they were labeled here. Those are aperture settings, and they often start with an F when they're written out, f22, f16, and they're laid out. Our digital cameras can get much more incremental and can go between these numbers, but in a traditional film camera, f22 to f16 would let in half as much light, or would let in twice as much light, sorry. And if you went f16 to f22, it would let in half as much light. Now, the confusing thing, and something you just have to remember, unfortunately, is that f22, the higher number, is actually the smaller aperture opening, so the smaller hole, which means it lets in less light, right? Whereas the smaller number here, f1.4, is the larger aperture opening and where the aperture is most open. Now, this is also called the speed of the lens. So if you're looking at this lens right here, on the inside ring it says Pentax 1 to 2 50 millimeter. That 2 is the speed of the lens. So this lens aperture gets open. The widest it opens is what's called f2. In general, the smaller that number, the more expensive the lens gets, the higher quality, the more versatile the lens gets as well. It means it can go into lower light situations and still be able to capture more light for you to be able to hold your camera more still. Now, you'll see here too, more light, faster, shallow depth of field. Don't worry too much right now about depth of field. We'll tackle that a little bit more in depth later. Now, moving on from there, the visual that I like is, your pupil works this way. When you walk into a light situation, your pupil closes down. It lets in less light, right? If you walk into a dark situation, your pupil opens up. So if you can analogize that and think of a lens as your pupil, that's a good way to remember this. Now, shutter speed deals with time. And we know this about photography, that time and photography are good cousins. They work well together. They're interested in one another. Now, you'll see here that these are dealing in seconds. These are called your shutter speed. So in the back of a camera, in our digital SLRs, there's a mirror inside here, and the digital SLR, which is digital single lens reflex, that reflex is the mirror mechanism that lifts in order to let light come through the lens and go into or hit the sensor or the film in the back of the camera. Now, the shutter speed and its use of time is to control or freeze or blur or deal with motion. And so I like to think about it like my eye blinking. Right? It's the blinking mechanism. So if I blink faster, things become choppier. If I blink less, things move through and I see them in full, but they might be a little bit blurrier, or they might trail a little bit. Now, I'm going to open up the back of this so you can see the shutter mechanism. This is traditional shutter. So I'm going to start with 60th of a second and give you a sense of that the sound of that time interval. If I go down to a full second, much longer, meaning more light is getting in. And if I go up to 1,000th of a second, much quicker. Now you can imagine that the faster it is, it freezes action. So sports photography, those things, they want to be able to freeze things that are moving quickly, so they need that higher shutter speed. Whereas if you're doing night photography and want to let in as much light as possible, you might want those longer intervals of time, like a second to 30 seconds, whatever makes sense for what you're doing. Now you'll see that that shutter is like a gate, just like you're blinking. Right? And so if I, again, open that up, I'm going to use the bulb setting, which allows me to hold that open so you can see right through. Now, ISO is, I like to talk in terms of film and then move into digital, but ISO is the sensitivity of your film, which is, again, allowing you to be either more or less versatile in one sense. So sensor sensitivity here, the smaller the number, right, the less sensitive that sensor is, but it does give you what would be called less noise. In terms of film, that would be called less grain or sharper. The grain is closer together, so it looks more sharp, whereas, or cleaner in detail. Whereas if you went into a darker situation, you may need to use a higher ISO, or have more sensitive, or change your settings to make your sensor more sensitive to light in order to capture that low light situation, and that generates or creates what's called more noise, and in traditional film that would be called more grain or less detail, meaning when you blow it up you see the kind of dots of grain. In terms of digital photography, it means that you're going to see more noise elements, which would be chunkier pixels, or even a breakdown in some of those color pixels to where you're getting absent or incorrect colors. Now, this I sent you another tutorial, that Adorama, that's going to help make this a little bit more sense, but I'm going to jump and use what's called our camera simulator here. Now this is a link again. I've given you two. I'm going to start with Camerism, because I like the visual. It'll take you here. You're going to want to make sure that you select the flash and hit download if that asks you for it. And I'm going to say allow on my browser. I'm using Chrome as a browser, and it should load this simulator for me. It's going to ask you to buy it. Don't buy this. You're allowed to use it up to a certain amount of times for free, and that's all you should probably need for now. Now we've loaded this simulator, and what you're looking at is it's a simulation as if you were looking through the viewfinder in your camera and looking at what would be the light meter reading inside your camera. This is going to give me a reading of my shutter speed in time. You're going to have to learn these numbers in general in order to understand this. But this is your f-stop, this is an f8, and this is your sensitivity, film sensitivity. So what I want you to do is I want you to play around with the simulator. I want you to do it in manual mode. I want you to play around with the lighting so you can see the difference in what's happening with exposure. Right now my shutter speed's at 1/25th of a second at f8, and if I get too dark here, it's not able to keep up with my image to give me a proper exposure. For instance, right now it's showing me that I'm, say, a stop underexposed, and if I hit this, it'll show that it's too dark. I'm going to return to Finder here. Now, in order to compensate for this, you have a couple avenues. If I've gotten too dark here, don't worry about distance and focal length yet. You can do one of three things here. You can adjust these in order to make this properly exposed, to bring it back to what would become 0. So if I wanted to use ISO, I could change that to 400, which effectively would be letting in twice as much light, going from 2 to 400. I could open up my aperture to 5.6 until I got that setting, or let me go back to 8, or I can create a slower shutter speed, which would be 60th of a second, in order to let in more light. Now if I select this, it should give me a proper exposure. Now things I want you to start paying attention to are the time element. So this gets blurry, for instance, because I use 60th of a second, which is a slower shutter speed than 1/25th. So if I wanted to, and I wanted to make sure that I froze that item, I could jump up to, say, 800ths of a second. But again, I've gone underexposed here, so I need to find a way to make this more sensitive. Maybe I go to 800 and I open up my aperture. So I'm letting in more light here, I'm making it more sensitive. Now watch what happens to that pinwheel. It's more frozen. Right? But I've sacrificed some of that by increasing my ISO. When I increase my ISO, I make more noise. Okay? So coming back here, I can return. Now again, what you're looking at here is your light reading. This is what your light meter will say is proper exposure. If you went to 1 or 2, sometimes in some cameras there'll just be notches. They're longer notches than these smaller ones. That's 1 stop and 2 stops. 1 stop, 2 stop. In either direction you have overexposure and underexposure. And in general, you're seeing what would be letting in half as much light or letting in twice as much light, and then letting in twice as much light again or half as much light again. Now I'm going to stop this video, and I'm going to move us on to working on understanding our bracketing. Okay.